Deep in the heart of Rome, there is a place that is not on any tourist map. It has no grand entrance for the public, no souvenir shop. It exists mostly as a number, a measurement that struggles to fit into the human imagination. 85 kilometers, or, if you prefer, 53 miles. If you were to lay its shelves end to end, they would stretch from the Vatican walls almost to the sea. This is the scale of the Vatican Apostolic Archive. For centuries it was known more dramatically as the Secret Archive, a name that conjures images of forbidden knowledge and sealed vaults. But the reality is something far more profound. This is not merely a library. A library is a place you visit. An archive is a place that remembers. This is the institutional memory of a power that has watched empires rise and fall for nearly 2,000 years. It holds the paper trail of saints and sinners, kings and heretics, astronomers and theologians. 12 centuries of correspondence, papal bulls, trial records and financial ledgers, all preserved in climate-controlled silence. When you think about it, the human brain is the most complex object we know of in the universe. But what is the brain of a 2,000-year-old institution? It might look something like this: a labyrinth of documents, a vast, quiet network where the history of the Western world is not just stored, but organised, catalogued, and selected. And that is where our investigation begins. Not with sensational claims of what might be hidden on those shelves, but with a more fundamental question. What does it mean for a single institution to be the custodian of such a vast portion of human history? What is the relationship between holding the memory of the past and wielding power in the present? An archive is never neutral. It is a story told by its keepers. And the power to tell the story, to decide what is recorded, what is preserved, and crucially what is accessible, is perhaps the greatest power of all. The secrets of the Vatican, then, may not be hidden objects, like a lost gospel or a strange artifact. The real secret might be the system itself, the architecture of control that determines who gets to ask the questions and who is permitted to see the answers. Before we can even begin to speculate about what lies on those 53 miles of shelves, we have to understand the first and most powerful barrier, the door, and the invisible rules that govern who is allowed to open it. So, how does one walk those 53 miles of history? The answer is, you don't. Not really. Access to the Vatican Apostolic Archive is not a right. It is a privilege, granted under a strict and unyielding set of rules. This is not a public library. It is a sovereign institution's private memory, and it decides who's allowed to read it. To even apply for an entry card, a scholar must possess an advanced degree, typically a doctorate, and provide a detailed research proposal, vetted and approved. Once inside, they are not free to wander. They must request specific documents, which are then delivered to a quiet, monitored reading room. There is a daily limit. According to the archive's own regulations, researchers may request up to 3 folders per day. It's a slow, deliberate process, designed for precision, not for browsing. But the most significant rule is not about who gets in or how many pages they can see, it's about time. This is the so-called 75-year rule. As a standard practice, the documents of a given pontificate are only made available for scholarly review 75 years after the end of that pope's reign. The official rationale is perfectly reasonable: to protect diplomatic relations, the reputations of individuals mentioned in sensitive documents, and the privacy of the Church's internal affairs. It ensures that history can be studied with a cool head, free from the passions of the moment. Before we go deeper into what this system of control truly means, a brief request. If you find this investigation valuable, supporting it with a like is a real contribution to our work, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Also, I'm curious to know our geography. Please write in the comments what time it is where you are right now. Done? Then let's continue. Think about what that 75-year delay actually does. It creates a mandatory buffer between an event and our ability to study its primary records. It means that, as a rule, no living person directly involved in a major historical decision will be alive to be questioned when the documents about it are finally released. The archive, then, is not simply a passive storage facility. It is an active instrument for managing memory. It doesn't just preserve the past, it determines the pace at which the present is allowed to understand it. This perfectly logical bureaucratic system of control creates a vacuum, and in that vacuum, rumours and legends are born. But this is where the official story ends and another, darker one begins. Such strict methodical control over information doesn't just create order, it creates a vacuum, a space of deep shadow where facts are scarce, and so legend takes root. In this vacuum, the Vatican Apostolic Archive has been given another name, a name whispered in forums and spoken in hushed tones in documentaries: the Black Library. This isn't an official designation. It's a myth, a powerful idea that suggests behind the 53 miles of official history lies another, unwritten history of humanity. And like any powerful myth, it has its stories. One of the most persistent of these modern legends speaks of an event in 1998. The story goes that a low-level archivist, or perhaps a disgruntled construction worker, smuggled a camera into a newly discovered section of the archive, deep beneath the accepted levels. He took a single photograph of a corridor lined with books bound not in leather, but in some strange metallic substance. The photo, it is said, briefly appeared online before being scrubbed from existence. The informant, a healthy man in his mid-30s, reportedly died of a sudden massive heart attack just weeks later. This is a compelling story. It has all the elements of a classic thriller: a forbidden place, a secret revealed, a whistleblower silenced. It's the kind of story that feels true because it confirms our deepest suspicions about power. But we must be precise here. Despite many claims, no credible, verifiable copy of this photograph exists. The story of the informant is an internet legend, impossible to independently confirm. It is not evidence. What's more important than whether the story is literally true is why it exists at all. It's a symptom. When an institution of immense historical and spiritual authority operates with such profound opacity, it creates the perfect conditions for such tales to grow. The legend of the Black Library isn't really about a specific room or a specific book. It is a story we tell ourselves to give a concrete shape to an abstract fear, the fear that the most important parts of our own history are being deliberately kept from us. And this points to a much more verifiable and perhaps more disturbing form of secrecy. The most effective way to control history is not necessarily to hide physical objects in a secret room. It is to decide which ideas are never allowed to become part of the story in the first place. The real archive of the forbidden isn't made of stone and shelves. It's made of the texts that were never copied, the philosophies that were declared heresy, and the questions that were deemed too dangerous to ask. And that archive is not a myth. We have the receipts. This brings our investigation to a critical turning point. The stories of secret vaults and lost artifacts are compelling. They speak to a deep-seated feeling that something vital has been hidden from us. But what if we've been looking for the wrong kind of secret? What if the most powerful act of concealment isn't about locking a specific book in a deep underground chamber? What if the most profound secret is the library itself? Let me explain what I mean. An archive, any archive, is more than just a collection of documents. It is a machine for creating a specific version of reality. The real power isn't in what it holds, but in the decision of what gets to be on the shelves in the first place. The power lies in the act of selection. This process creates what is known as a canon, an official, authorized collection of knowledge that is declared to be true, important, and worthy of preservation. Everything else is by definition left outside. And this, I think, is a much more powerful idea than any hidden chamber. Because hiding a book means you believe that book has power. But deciding that a book should not exist in the official story at all, that is an act of shaping reality itself. It's the difference between censoring a sentence and rewriting the entire language. By controlling the canon, an institution doesn't just control the past, it controls the very tools we use to understand the present and imagine the future. Put differently, the greatest secrets may not be objects hidden within the Vatican's walls. The greatest secret might be the wall itself, the conceptual wall that separates authorized history from the vast, chaotic ocean of what was forgotten, discarded, or deliberately destroyed. The central question of our investigation then shifts. It's no longer just what is in the archive. It's __quote _to__. To answer that, we have to go back to a time before the shelves were filled, before the canon was set in stone. We have to travel back to the chaotic, vibrant, and fiercely contested world of early Christianity, where the story of Western civilization was not yet written, and multiple versions were fighting to become the truth. To understand the true nature of this conceptual archive, we have to travel back in time, back to an era before the Vatican even existed as we know it, to the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries after Christ. And we have to start by letting go of a very powerful assumption. We tend to think of early Christianity as a single, unified movement that grew and spread from a central source, a single story, a single set of beliefs. But the historical record, according to scholars like Bart Ehrman, suggests something far more chaotic and far more interesting. Before there was one, official Christianity, there were many Christianities. In those first centuries, the spiritual landscape of the Roman Empire was a vibrant and sometimes violent marketplace of ideas. There were the Ebionites, who believed Jesus was a mortal prophet, not a divine being. There were the Marcionites, who argued that the vengeful God of the Old Testament was a different, lesser entity than the loving Father of Jesus. And then there were the Gnostics. Of all the competing Christianities, the Gnostics were perhaps the most philosophically sophisticated, and ultimately, the most dangerous to the emerging church hierarchy. The very name gives away their secret. Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosticism. It means, quote, three. But this wasn't the kind of knowledge you get from reading a scroll or memorizing a catechism. It wasn't about faith in something an authority tells you is true. Gnosis was direct, personal, experiential knowledge. It was a kind of spiritual insight, an awakening to the divine that could be achieved by an individual through introspection and contemplation. And this led to their central and most subversive teaching. The Gnostics believed that a spark of the divine exists within every human being. The kingdom of God, they would argue, is not a physical place you go to after death. It is a state of consciousness, a reality hidden within you, waiting to be discovered. Salvation wasn't something granted by an external institution. It was the act of remembering your own divine origin. If you pause and think about that idea for a moment, you can feel its political weight. You can feel why it was so threatening. If the divine is inside you, if you can access it directly through gnosis, what is the purpose of a priest? What is the function of a bishop, a sacrament, a church? An entire hierarchy of intermediaries, which claims to hold the exclusive keys to the kingdom, suddenly becomes unnecessary. This wasn't just a theological disagreement. It was a fundamental challenge to the entire architecture of institutional power that was beginning to form. It was a declaration of spiritual independence, and for an empire seeking a single, unifying religion to help manage its population, independence was the last thing it wanted. For over 1,500 years, this vibrant, chaotic marketplace of early Christian ideas was known to us only through the writings of its enemies. The so-called heretics had been silenced so completely that their voices were gone, their books turned to ash. We only knew what the victors of those ancient theological wars chose to tell us. And then, in December of 1945, near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, a local farmer looking for fertilizer stumbled upon a sealed earthenware jar. Inside, he found a collection of 13 ancient leather-bound books. These weren't copies of the familiar Gospels. They were the lost library of a Gnostic Christian community, hidden away in the 4th century, likely to protect them from the tightening grip of the new, state-sanctioned orthodoxy. This discovery was the Dead Sea Scrolls of early Christianity. For the first time, the silenced could speak for themselves. Among these texts was one that sent a shockwave through the world of theology, the Gospel of Thomas. It is not a story, not a narrative of Jesus' life. It is a collection of 114 secret sayings, which the text claims were spoken by the living Jesus. I want to be clear here. We are not claiming this is what Jesus really said. What matters is that this text shows us what a significant community of early Christians believed he said, and what they believed was philosophically explosive. Consider just one of these sayings, saying number 3. Jesus says, "The kingdom of God is inside of you, and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father. But if you will not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and it is you who are that poverty." Let's unpack that. ___, quote _6__. This simple phrase dismantles the entire logic of an intermediary church. The divine is not located in a specific building or in a distant heaven accessible only after death. It is an innate, internal state of being. It is a present reality within human consciousness. And then, quote 7, this means the divine is also immanent in the world around us, visible in nature, in other people, in reality itself. It's an experience to be had, not a doctrine to be memorized. If that sounds too abstract, let me put it more directly. If the ultimate spiritual reality is accessible both through introspection and through direct observation of the world, what then is the function of a priest? What is the purpose of a bishop, a sacrament, or a sacred institution that claims to be the sole gatekeeper to God? The Gospel of Thomas doesn't just disagree with the emerging church on a few points of theology, it renders its entire power structure philosophically unnecessary. It presents a path to salvation through Gnosticism, through direct personal knowledge, not through obedience to an external authority. This wasn't a minor variation. This was a different operating system for reality. And if this was just one text from one community, it raises a profoundly uncomfortable question. If ideas this powerful, this self-sufficient, were circulating freely, written down and treasured by communities across the Mediterranean, what happened? What event, what force, was powerful enough to not just argue against them, but to methodically hunt them down and erase them from human memory for nearly 2 millennia? For 3 centuries, this ecosystem of belief was allowed to grow wild, chaotic, and decentralized. There was no single headquarters, no final authority. But an empire cannot be built on 100 different truths. An empire needs one story, one doctrine, one point of control. And in the early 4th century, the most powerful man in the world decided it was time to impose order. This is where many popular stories about the Vatican's secrets take a specific turn. There is a powerful, persistent myth, repeated in books and movies, that in the year 325, at the First Great Council of Nicaea, a group of bishops gathered under the watchful eye of the Roman Emperor Constantine and voted. They voted on which Gospels were divinely inspired and which were heresy. They voted on which stories would become the New Testament and which would be cast out and burned. It is a dramatic scene, the fate of Christianity decided by a show of hands, and it is the perfect foundation for any theory of a grand conspiracy. But according to the overwhelming consensus of historians, including scholars like Bart Ehrman, who have spent their lives studying these texts, it is simply not what happened. The Council of Nicaea did not determine the canon of the Bible. To be fair, the reality is, in many ways, more interesting. The Council was not called to edit a book, but to solve a political crisis that threatened to tear the Roman Empire apart. The central question was not which text to include, but the very nature of Christ himself. A priest from Alexandria named Arius was teaching that Jesus, while divine, was a created being. He was made by God the Father, and therefore was not co-eternal with him. This might sound like a subtle theological distinction to us now, but in the 4th century, it was ideological dynamite. If Christ was a lesser, created being, then the entire foundation of the faith was different. It created a deep, violent rift across the Christian world. And for Emperor Constantine, who had only recently legalized Christianity and hoped to use it as a kind of social glue for his sprawling, fractured empire, this was unacceptable. A church at war with itself could not unify an empire. So Constantine did what powerful rulers do. He convened a meeting. He brought hundreds of bishops to Nicaea in modern-day Turkey. And he demanded a resolution. He was not there as a theologian. He was there as a chairman of the board enforcing a merger. The council's primary achievement was not a table of contents, but a contract, the Nicene Creed. A carefully worded statement of faith designed specifically to make the Arian position illegitimate. It declared that the Son was of one substance with the Father. It was a declaration of unity by force. This is the real secret of Nicaea. It was the moment the raw, diverse energy of early Christianity was first channeled through the machinery of the state. It wasn't about hiding a book. It was about establishing a principle that there would be a single, correct, quote, _9 version of the faith, and that the power of the empire would stand behind it. The process of selection had begun, not by hiding documents in a vault, but by defining the very idea of a quote, _10 document in the first place. So, if the Bible wasn't finalized at Nicaea, How and when did the New Testament as we know it actually come to be? The answer reveals a much longer, quieter, and more deliberate process of selection. A process that tells us even more about how a library of ideas becomes a single authoritative book. So, if the list of sacred books wasn't chosen at Nicaea, the next question is unavoidable. When was it decided? And more importantly, by whom? The answer is not a single dramatic event. It's something far more revealing about how power and information truly work. It's a slow, messy, and deeply political process that unfolded over centuries. The need for a single, unified canon became urgent after Nicaea, but the solution didn't appear overnight. For decades, the debate continued to rage. Different churches, led by powerful bishops in cities like Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, held different lists of authoritative texts. A book considered sacred scripture in one region could be dismissed as a dangerous forgery in another. The Shepherd of Hermas, the Epistle of Barnabas, the Apocalypse of Peter, these were all contenders that were, at one time or another, read in churches as scripture. The historical anchor we are looking for, the first surviving document in history that lists the exact 27 books of our modern New Testament, and only those 27, appears more than 40 years after the Council of Nicaea. It's not a decree from an emperor or a council, it's a letter. In the year 367, a powerful bishop from Alexandria named Athanasius wrote his annual Easter message to the churches under his authority. These were known as festal letters, and in this 39th letter, he sought to end the confusion about which books should be read. He lists the books of the Old Testament, and then he writes, and I am paraphrasing here, quote 11, then he lists the 27 books we know today. Let's be very clear about what this means. This wasn't a revelation. It was an administrative memo from a regional authority. It was written more than 300 years after the life of Christ. The generations who might have had any living memory of the apostles were long gone. What we are witnessing here is not the preservation of a pure original memory. We are witnessing the construction of an official one. Even Athanasius's letter wasn't the final word. It was a powerful recommendation from an influential figure, but it still had to be adopted. It took several more local church councils, like those in Hippo in 393 and Carthage in 397, to formally ratify his list for their own regions. The process was less about a sudden discovery of the truth, and more about a slow, grinding campaign for institutional consensus. One by one, the other versions of Christianity were starved of legitimacy. Their texts were no longer copied, their perspectives were no longer taught. This is the real secret of the canon. It wasn't hidden in a vault. It was created in plain sight through a centuries-long process of selection, debate, and exclusion. It was the foundational act of building an information monopoly. Before you can hide specific secrets, you must first establish the power to decide what counts as truth, and that power was now being forged into the very bedrock of a new, unified, and controllable faith. So, let's bring the threads of this investigation together. What we've witnessed is not a single, lightning-strike moment of conspiracy. It's a slow, methodical, and profoundly human construction. A vast, diverse ecosystem of spiritual thought, from the Gnostics who sought the divine within, to dozens of early communities with their own revered texts, was gradually channeled, filtered, and ultimately replaced by a single, authorized pipeline. The wild garden was trimmed, paved, and turned into a walled courtyard, and this is where we uncover the true secret. The one that isn't necessarily locked in a physical vault, but is hidden in plain sight, woven into the very architecture of the institution itself. The most profound secret is not a lost book. The secret is the memory that you never needed a book to be approved by a committee in the first place. The secret is the principle of spiritual self-sovereignty. Put differently, a person who believes, as the Gospel of Thomas suggests, that the kingdom of God is within them does not need a gatekeeper. A soul that can find its own way to the sacred does not need an official map drawn by an earthly power. By defining one set of texts as holy and all others as heresy, the emerging church achieved something of world historical importance. It didn't just offer one path to God, it claimed ownership of the only path. It turned salvation from an internal state of being into an external resource, a commodity that only it had the authority to distribute. This was the masterstroke. The creation of the intermediary. the establishment of a system where humanity was, in a sense, spiritually disenfranchised, told that it could no longer speak to the divine directly, but must from now on go through an approved hierarchical institution. Every archive, every canon, and every creed that followed was built upon this single, foundational act of control. The power did not come from knowing a secret, but from being the only one allowed to define what was and was not a secret. But controlling the story of humanity's relationship with God was only the first, terrestrial phase of this grand project. Once you've established yourself as the sole authority on heaven, the next logical step is to claim authority over the heavens themselves. The next frontier of control would be humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos, and this is where our investigation takes a sharp, unexpected turn. We move from the cool, silent corridors of the archive, from the scent of aging paper and ink, to the thin, dry air of a remote mountaintop, a place thousands of miles from Rome, under some of the clearest, darkest night skies on the planet. We are on Mount Graham in southeastern Arizona, and here a giant, sophisticated eye opens to the cosmos. It is the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, the VATT. This is not a metaphor. It is a verifiable, concrete fact. The Holy See, an institution built on ancient scripture and tradition, owns and operates a world-class astronomical research facility. It's an almost surreal juxtaposition. An organization that once put Galileo on trial for his observations of the heavens now employs Jesuit priests with doctorates in astrophysics to scan distant galaxies. The immediate, unavoidable question is, why? Why would an institution whose domain is the soul of humanity invest millions in the study of nebulae, exoplanets, and the origins of the universe? What are they searching for out there in the cold, silent darkness that they cannot find in their 53 miles of terrestrial archives? This isn't some historical relic, a forgotten hobby of a Renaissance pope. This is a modern, active, and respected scientific endeavour. The public face of this endeavour is a man who perfectly embodies this paradox, Brother Guy Consolmagno. He is an American research astronomer, a planetary scientist, a graduate of MIT, and the current director of the Vatican Observatory. When he speaks, he does so not as a mystic, but as a scientist, with a calm, rational, and often humorous demeanour. He talks about meteorites, the moons of Jupiter, and the elegant logic of physics. He is, by all accounts, a brilliant man of both faith and reason. And he insists the Church's interest in astronomy is a natural extension of its wonder at God's creation. It's a powerful and persuasive explanation. The idea that science and faith are not enemies, but two different paths to appreciating the same cosmic mystery. It paints a picture of an institution that has matured beyond its old conflicts, that has embraced the universe in all its complexity. This is the official story, the public story. And it is, to be fair, a perfectly reasonable one. But in an investigation like this, the reasonable explanation is never the final destination. It is the point from which we begin to ask the more difficult questions. Because when you look closer at the history, the statements, and the technology involved, another, much stranger, possibility begins to take shape. So, we're left with a fundamental question. Why does an institution built on ancient faith need a state-of-the-art instrument to look at the stars? The simplest way to answer this is to listen to the people who actually run the observatory, and their answer, it turns out, is remarkably clear, consistent, and intellectually robust. The public face and voice of the Vatican Observatory for many years has been its director, an American Jesuit brother and planetary scientist named Guy Consolmagno. If you expect to hear a man torn between medieval dogma and modern science, you will be disappointed. Consolmagno, and the institution he represents, argue that there is no conflict. Science and faith, in their view, are not enemies. They are two different but complementary ways of knowing the world. The official position is this: science is the tool we use to understand how the universe works. It measures, it calculates, it describes the physical mechanics of creation. But it cannot answer the question of why there is a universe at all. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why does the universe follow elegant mathematical laws? For them, these are not scientific questions, but theological and philosophical ones. To study the creation, therefore, is not an act of disbelief. It is an act of appreciating the work of the Creator, A telescope is just another way of reading God's other book, the book of nature. This is a clean, elegant argument, but it leads to a far more provocative question. What if we are not alone in this creation? What would the discovery of intelligent, non-human life do to a faith that seems so centered on humanity's story? The answer from the Vatican's astronomers is, again, surprisingly open. According to Consul Mano, the discovery of extraterrestrial life would not be a crisis for theology. It would be a gift. It would simply mean that God's creation is even more magnificent and diverse than we had imagined. In a now famous statement, when asked if he would baptize an alien, Consul Mano's reply was direct. He said only if she asked. He went on to explain that any entity, no matter its form, with intelligence, free will, a soul, and a conscience, would be seen as another of God's children. The act of baptism is a response to a being's free choice to enter the community of faith. The number of arms or the colour of their skin, or scales, is irrelevant. This is the principle of the strongest counterargument. The Vatican's public stance on astronomy and extraterrestrial life is not one of fear or secrecy. It is one of intellectual confidence. They present themselves as an institution so secure in its faith that it is not afraid of any truth the universe might reveal. It's a powerful, reasonable, and deeply compelling position. And if this were the only story, our investigation would end here. But it isn't. This calm, rational, and public-facing philosophy exists alongside a history of symbols, events, and silences that have fueled a much darker and far more unsettling interpretation. And this is precisely where the clear, documented path of our investigation forks. Up to this point, we have followed a trail of official statements, historical facts, and verifiable science. But to understand the deep suspicion surrounding the Vatican and the cosmos, we must now take a step onto the other path, a path of reinterpretation, of anomaly, and of theory. I want to be very clear. We are now leaving the world of what we can prove and entering the world of what some people believe is being deliberately hidden. The story begins not in an observatory, but in a field in Portugal on October 13th, 1917. An event that would become known as the Miracle of the Sun at Fatima. According to reports, a crowd of tens of thousands gathered, expecting a promised miracle. What they saw has been debated ever since. Witness accounts describe the sun appearing as an opaque spinning disk in the sky. It was said to tremble, to make sudden, incredible movements, and to zigzag towards the earth before returning to its place. For the Church, this was a divine sign, a miracle of the highest order. But for investigators in the 20th and 21st centuries, looking back at these descriptions through a different lens, the accounts sound eerily familiar. A silent, metallic-looking disk, spinning and manoeuvring in ways that defy conventional physics, radiating heat. Stripped of its religious context, the event at Fatima is described by some as one of the largest mass UFO sightings in history. This is the first layer of the theory, that a profound, unexplainable event of potentially extraterrestrial origin was witnessed, and then immediately absorbed and reframed by the institution best equipped to handle the unexplainable, the Church. Now let's return to the mountaintop in Arizona. The Vatican is a partner in the Large Binocular Telescope, or LBT, one of the most advanced optical telescopes in the world. And one of the instruments attached to that telescope, developed by German astronomers, was given a name that is almost too perfect for any conspiracy narrative. It was called Lucifer. For any theorist, this is a smoking gun. The name itself feels like a deliberate, almost arrogant provocation. To be fair, the official explanation is entirely technical and mundane. The name is an acronym for quote, _14____, it's a mouthful. And the scientists involved likely had no intention of fueling a myth. But in a story about an institution accused of hiding cosmic secrets, symbols matter. The fact remains. An instrument used with Vatican involvement to look into the darkness of space bore the name of the quote, _15, the fallen angel. This is the speculative jump. There is no document linking the Fatima event to a secret Vatican UFO file. There is no proof that the naming of an astronomical instrument was anything but a technical convenience. But when you place these two anomalies side by side, a historical miracle that reads like a modern UFO report and a modern telescope with a deeply symbolic name, a powerful, unsettling narrative begins to write itself. It's a narrative that suggests the Vatican's interest in the stars is not just theological or scientific, but also historical. A story that asks, what do they already know? Why would an institution that measures its history in millennia, whose authority rests on a story that began 2,000 years ago, even concern itself with strange lights in the sky? Whether you see the Fatima event as a divine miracle or a UFO sighting, the deeper question remains, what is truly at stake for the Vatican in the cosmic arena? The answer, according to this line of thinking, has nothing to do with flying discs or alien biology. It has to do with a story, the most important story ever told. Let's step back for a moment. At the very core of the Abrahamic worldview, the foundation upon which Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are built, is the concept of human centrality. Humanity is not an accident. We are the pinnacle of a divine creation, made in God's image, and the central actors in a cosmic drama of sin, salvation, and redemption. The entire universe, in this narrative, is the stage for our story. This isn't just a theological detail, it is the entire basis for the institution's authority. It is the source code of its power. Now, introduce another intelligent, technologically advanced civilization into that equation. What happens to the story? If humanity is not unique, if we are just one of many intelligent species in the cosmos, possibly not even the oldest or the wisest, then the entire stage collapses. The drama of our salvation is no longer the central plot of the universe. It becomes a local, planetary affair. The claim to be the sole intermediary for a universal truth becomes profoundly difficult to maintain. The discovery of extraterrestrial intelligence doesn't just challenge a few lines of scripture, it threatens the fundamental premise of humanity's special relationship with the divine. It decentralizes us. And this is where the two seemingly separate threads of our investigation, the suppression of Gnosticism and the alleged secrecy around the cosmos, suddenly connect. They are in fact the same story, told on different scales. The Gnostic Gospels proposed a radical decentralization of the divine within. They claim that the kingdom of God was not in the heavens, but inside each person, accessible through direct knowledge, or gnosis. This made the institution, the priest, the intermediary, unnecessary. It was a threat to the architecture of power from the inside out. The confirmation of alien intelligence would represent a radical decentralization of humanity without. It would suggest that we are not the sole proprietors of consciousness or spirit in the universe. This would make any single institution's claim to universal truth seem provincial, not absolute. It is a threat to the architecture of power from the outside in. In both cases, the motive for control is identical: to preserve a specific model of reality where a central authority is required to interpret our place in the universe. Whether the threat is a hidden gospel that says, quote, 16, or a hidden spaceship that says, quote, 17, the result is the same. The carefully constructed narrative of control is put at risk, and this pattern of managing the official story, of defending a linear, human-centric timeline against anything that might disrupt it, is not limited to the heavens. It extends deep into the earth, into the very soil that holds the secret history of our own origins. And so, having looked to the heavens, our investigation must now turn its gaze downward, into the deepest layers of the earth and the deepest strata of time. Because if an institution seeks to control the present, it must first control the story of the cosmos, but even more importantly, it must control the story of ourselves. The story of humanity, as we are taught it, is a straight line. It is a simple, elegant, and deeply comforting narrative. It begins in the dark caves of our most primitive ancestors, moves through the discovery of fire, the invention of the wheel, the birth of agriculture, the rise of the first cities, and then marches steadily forward, through empires and republics, through ages of faith and reason, through industrial and digital revolutions, culminating here, with us. At the pinnacle of the timeline, this narrative is more than just a collection of dates. It is the foundational myth of modern authority. It tells us that our civilization, our science, our institutions are the inevitable and superior result of thousands of years of linear progress. Every system of power, whether religious or secular, implicitly rests on this idea, that we stand at the apex of history, the inheritors of an unbroken ascent. But what if the line is not straight? What if it is a circle? Or perhaps a spiral, repeating themes and patterns on different levels? What if advanced civilizations have risen before us, reached incredible heights of knowledge and technology, and then, through cataclysm or decay, have fallen back into dust, leaving behind only the faintest whispers of their existence? This is the central, terrifying question at the heart of what is sometimes called forbidden archaeology. This isn't a formal academic discipline. To be clear, it's a label for a vast collection of anomalies, a catalogue of inconvenient questions that the straight line of history cannot easily answer. Its evidence consists of things that, according to the official timeline, simply should not exist. They are known as OOPARTs, an abbreviation for out-of-place artifacts. An OOPART is a piece of the past that feels like a glitch in the matrix, a set of sophisticated gears found in an ancient Greek shipwreck, capable of calculating astronomical cycles with a precision thought impossible for its time. A map drawn centuries before the age of exploration that appears to show the coast of Antarctica free of ice. Reports from 19th century newspapers of giant skeletons unearthed from ancient mounds. Each one, on its own, can be debated, explained away, or dismissed as a hoax. But taken together, they suggest a radical possibility. They suggest that our story is not one of a single, steady climb, but of cycles, of great floods and forgotten ages, of lost knowledge and technologies that we are only now beginning to rediscover. And this is why such a possibility is so dangerous to any institution built on the premise of being the final, ultimate authority. Because a single, verifiable object that is 1,000 years too early doesn't just rewrite a chapter of history. It proves that the entire book is wrong. It tells us that we are not the first, and it quietly suggests that we may not be the last. Before we step into the territory of myth and legend, we need to establish a crucial point. The idea that our accepted timeline of history is incomplete is not a fringe belief. It is not speculation. It is demonstrable, archaeological fact. The neat, linear story of human progress has already been broken, not by secret societies, but by science itself. We just haven't fully processed the implications. Let's begin in southeastern Turkey, at a site called Göbekli Tepe. For decades, it was dismissed as a medieval cemetery. But in the 1990s, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began to uncover what was really there. And what he found fundamentally rewrote the story of civilization. Imagine massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing up to 10 tons, covered in intricate carvings of animals. These pillars are arranged in large, complex circles. It is, without question, a temple, a vast, sophisticated ritual center. Here is the part that shatters the timeline. According to radiocarbon dating, Göbekli Tepe is approximately 11,600 years old. Let me put that in context. This is 6,000 years older than Stonehenge. It is 7,000 years older than the Great Pyramids of Giza. This monumental architecture was built by people who, according to our old story, should not have been capable of it. They were hunter-gatherers. They did not have agriculture. They did not have pottery, or writing, or the wheel. They did not even have metal tools. For a century we were taught a simple progression. First, humans invent agriculture, which allows them to settle down. This leads to villages, then cities, and only then, with a surplus of food and labour, do you get the luxury of complex religion and monumental art. Göbekli Tepe turns this entire sequence on its head. It suggests that it was the other way around. The immense coordinated effort required to build this temple may have been the very thing that pushed humans to invent agriculture, to feed the workers who built it. The dream came before the reality. Now, let's travel from the dawn of society to the peak of the classical world. In the year 1901, divers exploring an ancient Roman shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera recovered a strange object. For decades, it sat in a museum, a corroded, unassuming lump of bronze. It was only with the advent of X-ray and CT scanning technology in the later 20th century that researchers could finally see inside. What they discovered was breathtaking. The lump was a machine, an astonishingly complex system of over 30 interlocking bronze gears and dials. It has been called the world's first analog computer. The Antikythera mechanism was an astronomical calculator of unbelievable precision. It could predict the position of the sun, the moon, and the 5 known planets. It could predict eclipses decades in advance. It even tracked the 4-year cycle of the ancient Olympic Games. The level of mechanical engineering and theoretical astronomy required to build this device was not thought to have existed in the 2nd century BC. According to our established history, technology this complex would not reappear on Earth for another 1400 years with the astronomical clocks of medieval Europe. These two artifacts, Göbekli Tepe and the Antikythera mechanism, are not theories. They are facts. They sit in museums. You can see them. And they pose the same fundamental, deeply unsettling question. How can entire chapters of human capability be missing from our story? One discovery tears a hole in our understanding of social evolution. The other tears a hole in our understanding of technological evolution. They prove that the straight line of progress is a convenient fiction. Humanity's past is not a simple ascent. It is a landscape of ghost peaks and forgotten rivers. And if these are the anomalies that have surfaced by chance, it forces us to consider a much more radical question. What other evidence might exist that has not been so fortunate? The solid, measurable evidence from sites like Göbekli Tepe and the Antikythera mechanism acts as a gateway. Once the possibility of a flawed historical timeline is established, it emboldens the mind to consider even more radical questions. It opens the door from the proven anomalies of the past to the great, unproven legends that haunt the edges of our history. And there is no legend more persistent than that of a lost, high civilization, a predecessor, an island continent that possessed a wisdom and technology far beyond its time, only to be swallowed by the sea in a single day and night of misfortune. Atlantis. For thousands of years, the story has been a ghost in our collective memory, a dream of a golden age, a warning of hubris, and a tantalizing question. What if we are not the first? Alongside this grand narrative run other stranger currents. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, local newspapers across North America, particularly in the Ohio River Valley, were filled with hundreds of peculiar reports. Farmers digging new wells, workers laying railroad tracks, amateur archaeologists exploring burial mounds, all reporting the discovery of human skeletons of incredible size, skeletons of 7, 8, even 9 feet in height, sometimes described with double rows of teeth or unusual skull formations. The reports are numerous, strangely consistent, and then they simply stop. The bones, it is almost always said, were sent to a major institution for study and were never seen or heard from again. And right here, our investigation must draw a very sharp, very clear line in the sand. While these stories are deeply fascinating, and while they persist with an incredible tenacity in the public imagination, I must state this directly. There is currently no verifiable archaeological or archival evidence that confirms their reality. More importantly for our purposes, there is no paper trail, no catalogue entry, no chain of custody that connects any of these alleged discoveries, neither a single artifact from a mythical Atlantis, nor a single giant bone from an Ohio mound, to the Vatican's archives. To claim otherwise would be to abandon investigation for pure belief. So why bring them up at all? Because these legends, whether true or false, serve a more important function in our analysis. They are the ultimate stress test for the system of control we have been describing. The point is not to prove that giants walk the earth. The point is to ask a structural question. If an artifact were ever unearthed that could irrefutably shatter our entire paradigm of human history, proof of a global, technologically advanced civilization that predates our own by 10,000 years, what would happen to it? In a world of competing national interests, scientific rivalries, and public panic, who could be trusted to contain such a reality-breaking discovery? The question is not, does the Vatican have Atlantis in its basement? The question is, if Atlantis were ever found, would a system like the Vatican archives be the logical endpoint for its containment? This is a thought experiment about the nature of power and knowledge itself. So, we have unearthed the anomalies, the stone circles of Göbekli Tepe that rewrite our timelines, the impossible precision of the Antikythera mechanism, and the persistent, haunting legends of Atlantis. But this collection of mysteries, as fascinating as it is, forces us to ask a much deeper, more important question. It's not just quote 20, but quote 21. Why would an institution dedicated to history and faith have any interest in suppressing the story of our deep past? The answer has very little to do with archaeology and everything to do with power. The story we're told about human history is a straight line, an arrow shot from the past into the future. It's a narrative of linear progress. We started as hunter-gatherers, discovered fire, invented farming, built villages, then cities, then empires. Each step was an improvement on the last. In this story, our modern world, with its science, its governments, and its religious institutions, is the inevitable and logical endpoint. It is the pinnacle of civilization, the highest point humanity has yet reached. This narrative makes our authorities seem permanent, justified, and final. But a single, undeniable artifact from a forgotten high civilization breaks that line. It shatters the arrow of progress. It suggests that history is not a line at all, but a wheel, or perhaps a great repeating spiral. A cycle of rising and falling, of golden ages and dark ages, of civilizations that reached incredible heights of knowledge and power, only to be swept away and forgotten. If a civilization could build Göbekli Tepe 12,000 years ago, and then vanish so completely that we forgot it ever existed, it means greatness is not permanent. It means knowledge can be lost, and this is the existential threat. This is the secret that must be kept. For an institution that claims eternal authority, a monopoly on truth handed down through an unbroken chain of succession, the idea of a cyclical history is poison. It suggests that all systems, no matter how powerful, are temporary. It recasts the authority of the present from a permanent, divinely ordained state into just another temporary chapter in a very long, very unpredictable book. If other great worlds existed and fell, then ours can too, and so can its institutions. This is the ultimate political motive. The suppression of our true, cyclical past is not about hiding strange skeletons or golden machines. It is about protecting the perceived legitimacy and permanence of the present order. It is an act of narrative control designed to ensure that the story of linear progress, with our current authorities at its apex, remains the only story we are allowed to read. But a story this fundamental to the architecture of power doesn't stay suppressed by itself, merely by being locked away. It has to be actively managed. The alternative narratives and the people who carry them must be policed. This vast project of historical curation required an enforcement arm, an organization designed to hunt down, interrogate, and neutralize dangerous knowledge. An institution that would become infamous for its efficiency and its brutality, the Holy Inquisition. Up to this point, our investigation has focused on a quiet, passive form of control. The selection of texts, the locking of doors, the slow, patient curation of history from within the walls of an archive. But a monopoly on reality cannot be maintained by curation alone. Eventually, a competing idea becomes too powerful to simply ignore or exclude. When a dangerous thought escapes the confines of the archive and begins to spread, the system must shift from passive defense to active enforcement. It must go hunting, and this brings us to the Inquisition. The word itself conjures images of fire, of darkened torture chambers, of hooded figures passing judgment in the name of God. And all of that is true. The brutality was real. But to focus only on the physical cruelty is to miss the point. It's like studying an iceberg by looking only at the bloodstains on its peak. The true horror of the Inquisition was not its passion, but its cold, bureaucratic logic. It was a technology, a methodical, systematic apparatus designed for one purpose: to identify, map, and neutralize competing systems of knowledge. If we remove the religious language, the institution begins to look disturbingly modern. It was not simply a court that punished heresy. It was a bureaucracy of doctrinal security. Its agents did not just seek confessions, they sought intelligence. The goal of interrogation was not merely to break a person's will, but to extract their entire intellectual network. Who taught you these ideas? What books have you read? Who did you speak to? Where are the other books? Every question was designed to map the contagion of the forbidden thought. The records they kept were meticulous. Every confession, every accusation, every detail of a heretical cosmology was documented, cross-referenced, and filed away. The Inquisition was, in its own way, one of the most effective information-gathering operations in history. It built a comprehensive database of the very ideas it sought to destroy. It functioned less like a court of faith, and more like an early form of an intelligence agency, but one whose primary target was not state secrets, but the secrets of reality itself. This was the enforcement arm of the Great Conceptual Archive. While one part of the system was deciding which books would form the official story, this other part was dedicated to finding and burning all the competing drafts. It wasn't just about punishing individuals for what they believed, it was about ensuring that the linear, controllable narrative of history and theology remained the only one available. It was the ultimate act of editing. To see how this cold intellectual system worked in practice, we must look at the fate of one man. A man whose mind was so expansive and whose ideas were so threatening that the system spent years hunting him down before deciding that the only way to silence his thoughts was to turn his body to ash. His name was Giordano Bruno. To understand this active enforcement, this war on ideas, we must leave the abstract system of the Inquisition and focus on a single human life. We need to go to Rome, to a public square called the Campo de' Fiori, the _quote_22__ today. It is a bustling market. But at its centre stands a dark hooded statue, a silent monument to a day of fire and ash. It is the statue of Giordano Bruno. And if you were to ask most people why he was burned at the stake there on February 17, 1600, you would likely get a simple answer. He claimed the earth revolved around the sun. This is the schoolbook version of the story. A brave man of science, a martyr for astronomy, executed by a dogmatic church that refused to look through the telescope. It's a powerful story, but it is not the whole truth. In fact, it misses the point entirely. To be fair, Bruno did champion the Copernican model, but so did many others, including some within the church itself, who were not executed for it. The records of his 8-year trial show that the heliocentric model was part of the charges, but it was far from the most dangerous idea he possessed. The Inquisition was not ultimately terrified of a moving earth. It was terrified of an expanding God. Bruno's true heresy was metaphysical. He looked at Copernicus's model and did not just see a new arrangement of planets. He saw the key to unlocking a radically different universe. He argued that if the Earth was not the centre, then there was no centre. The universe, he proposed, was infinite, and if it was infinite, it must contain an infinity of worlds, like our own, circling their own suns. And on those worlds, there could be other living, thinking beings. This alone was a profound challenge to the established cosmos, but Bruno took one final, fatal step. He declared that God was not some distant king, ruling this infinite creation from an external throne. Instead, God was the soul of the world. The divine was present in everything, in the stars, in the rocks, in the plants, and most dangerously within every single human being. This is pantheism, and if you listen closely you can hear the echo of the Gnostics. If God is everywhere, if the divine is a universal presence accessible in all of nature and within the human heart, then what is the purpose of a single centralized institution as the sole gatekeeper to salvation? If any star can be an altar and any mind a temple, the magnificent cathedrals of Rome become beautiful but unnecessary. The priest is no longer a vital intermediary, but just another man. Bruno didn't just challenge the Church's astronomy, he challenged its entire reason for being. He dissolved the very architecture of its power, and for that there was no forgiveness. He was not killed for what he saw in the sky. He was killed for what he saw in the nature of reality itself. His death was a message. Some ideas are so dangerous they must be met not with argument but with fire. The execution of a single thinker, however brutal, is a messy and public affair. It creates martyrs. It turns a man into a symbol, but more importantly, it doesn't solve the fundamental problem. You can burn a man, but you cannot burn an idea once it has been written down. A book has a life of its own. It can be copied, translated, and hidden. It can sleep for a century on a dusty shelf and then, in the right hands, wake up and change the world all over again. An institution that seeks to control the narrative of reality must therefore confront this problem directly. It needs a more systematic, more scalable solution than the stake and the pyre. It needs a weapon not against people, but against their thoughts. It needs a list. And for 400 years, the Vatican had one. It was called the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. This was not a secret document. It was not a whispered rumour. It was an official, publicly maintained list of publications deemed heretical, dangerous, or contrary to the established faith. First formally issued in 1559, and only officially abolished in 1966, the Index was one of the longest-running, most ambitious projects of institutional censorship in human history. To be placed on the Index was to have your work declared a threat to the soul of Christendom. And the names on this list tell a story. It's a story of what a centralized system of thought fears most. Of course, you find the astronomers who displaced humanity from the center of creation. Copernicus's On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres remained on the list for over 200 years. Galileo's works were there, as were those of Johannes Kepler, but the Index reached far beyond the stars. It sought to police the very architecture of the human mind. The works of René Descartes, the father of modern philosophy, were condemned. Immanuel Kant, who argued for the power of human reason to understand the world, was forbidden. The writings of John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose ideas on natural rights and the social contract would fuel revolutions, were deemed too dangerous for a public to read. From Victor Hugo to Alexandre Dumas, from Spinoza to Voltaire, thousands of the most influential works of science, philosophy and literature were, at one time or another, blacklisted. The crucial point here is not just that the Church disagreed with these authors. The threat was far more fundamental. Each of these forbidden books offered its reader an alternative operating system for reality. A way of knowing the world and one's place in it that did not require the Church as the sole intermediary. They argued that truth could be found in mathematics, in observation, in individual reason, or in the consent of the governed. In short, they empowered the individual mind, and for a system built on centralized authority there is no greater threat. This was the ultimate firewall, designed to protect the official narrative from the virus of independent thought. And this leads to a final, deeply ironic realization about this entire system of control. It exposes a hidden paradox at the heart of the Inquisition's mission. How do you truly and effectively forbid an idea? How do you ensure a dangerous book is never read again? The simple answer is to burn it. But the institutional answer is far more complex. To place a book on the Index, you must first read it. To condemn a heresy, you must first understand its arguments, often better than its own adherents. The censor, in a strange way, must become the world's leading expert on the very thoughts he is tasked to destroy. He must dissect them, document them, and create a meticulous record of their every error. This process, repeated over centuries, generated a colossal amount of data, detailed transcripts from interrogations, theological reports analysing forbidden cosmologies, inventories of confiscated libraries from scholars, mystics, and alchemists. What happened to all this information? What happened to the thousands of books seized from the hands of men like Giordano Bruno? They were not all destroyed. According to this line of investigation, they were absorbed. This is the final, crucial function of the Inquisition. It was not just an enforcement agency, it was an intelligence-gathering operation. Every dangerous idea, every suppressed text, every alternative worldview it encountered was documented, catalogued, and channeled back to the central nervous system in Rome. The very act of suppression enriched the archive. So the two great arms of this system, the archive and the Inquisition, were not separate. They were a feedback loop. The archive defined the truth, and the Inquisition went out into the world to neutralize anything that contradicted it, sending back the spoils of its intellectual conquests. The Apostolic Archive, therefore, is not just a library of what the Church chose to remember. It is also a meticulously indexed ghost library, a perfect negative image of every idea the system deemed too dangerous for the world to know. It is a vault containing not just one history, but the blueprints of 1,000 conquered realities. This vast, self-reinforcing machine for defining and defending a single version of reality was perfected over centuries. It seemed unbreachable, eternal. But this system was built for a world of paper and ink, of slow travel and centralized authority. What happens when it faces a force it can neither catalogue nor burn nor control? Some believe that the end of this ancient order was not just inevitable, but that it was foretold long ago. We have now traced the architecture of a system, a structure designed not just to house documents, but to house reality itself. It began with the physical act of selection. What enters the archive, what is left outside. It evolved into the conceptual act of defining truth. What becomes canon, what is deemed heresy. And when ideas became too dangerous to simply exclude, the system developed an immune response, an active, bureaucratic, and sometimes brutal enforcement of its intellectual borders. We have seen a machine built over centuries to curate, to control, and to defend a single, authorized version of history. But this brings us to the final, and perhaps most urgent question of our investigation. Is this system permanent? Can any structure built to contain the flow of knowledge survive indefinitely? Or does it, by its very nature, create the pressures that will lead to its own collapse? History suggests that every empire, no matter how powerful, eventually faces a crisis. And for an empire of information, that crisis is revelation. It seems that for as long as this institution has existed, there has been a shadow narrative, a persistent whisper that it will not last forever. This counter-narrative has often taken the form of prophecy, visions, cryptic texts, and coded predictions that speak of a great apostasy, a final pope, and a dramatic end to the age of institutional control. These are stories of a final reckoning, when the archive is thrown open and its deepest secrets are laid bare. And here, we must be very clear about our approach for this final act. Our goal is not to prove these prophecies true or false. We are not here as mystics or debunkers. Instead, we are going to examine them as powerful cultural and psychological artifacts. We will ask, what do these stories tell us about the institution they challenge? Why has the idea of its eventual fall been such a constant and powerful theme for centuries? In short, we will treat these prophecies not as a guide to the future, but as a mirror reflecting the hidden tensions of the present and the past. They are the ultimate expression of the belief that a secret cannot be kept forever. These are stories born from the very existence of locked doors and sealed archives. They are the human imagination pushing back against the idea of a permanent information monopoly. They are narratives that insist upon a final chapter, a moment when the curators lose control of the story. And the most famous, most politically charged, and most debated of these narratives, a story centered on a secret message held under lock and key for decades, is the third secret of Fatima. And to explore that question, our investigation must now turn to one of the most explosive and controversial episodes in 20th century religious history. It's a story that perfectly encapsulates the tension between divine revelation and institutional management. A story of a sealed envelope, a 40-year delay, and a secret that many believe has still never been fully told. We need to talk about Fatima. The story begins in 1917, in the small Portuguese town of Fatima. 3 shepherd children reported a series of apparitions of the Virgin Mary. Over several months they were given 24, the first 2 were revealed relatively early. The first was a terrifying vision of hell. The second, according to the children, was a prophecy that the Great War would end, but a worse one would follow if humanity did not repent. It also spoke of the rise and spread of Russia's errors, widely interpreted as the rise of atheistic communism, and called for the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. But it was the third secret that would become the subject of decades of frantic speculation. The sole surviving seer, Sister Lucia dos Santos, wrote it down in 1944 and placed it in a sealed envelope, with instructions that it was not to be opened and revealed to the world until 1960, because, as she stated, it will be clearer then. 1960 came and went. The world waited. The envelope remained sealed. Pope John XXIII reportedly opened and read the secret in 1959. According to accounts, he was visibly distressed and chose to return it to the archives, stating that the secret does not concern my pontificate. His successor, Pope Paul VI, also read it, and also chose to keep it hidden. For 40 years, the third secret of Fatima became a focal point of anxiety and suspicion. What could be so terrifying that multiple popes would defy a direct celestial instruction to reveal it? Finally, in the year 2000, Pope John Paul II authorized its release. The world held its breath. The secret, the Vatican announced, was a symbolic vision. It described a bishop dressed in white making his way through a ruined city, past the corpses of martyrs, and then being shot and killed by soldiers. The Vatican's official interpretation was that this vision was a prophecy of the 20th century's persecution of the Church, culminating in the failed assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II himself in 1981. For many, this explanation was profoundly anticlimactic, and for a dedicated group of researchers and believers known as Fatimists, it was simply not credible. The central question was one of proportion. Why would a vision of an event that had already happened be kept under lock and key for 40 years with such gravity? It seemed to lack the earth-shattering, future-altering weight of the first two secrets. Controversies erupted, fueled by discrepancies in accounts, and the belief that the Vatican had only released a portion of the true secret, a sanitized version to quell public speculation. Here, we are not concerned with proving or disproving the prophecy itself. That is a matter of faith. Our investigation focuses on the handling of the information. For 40 years, a piece of knowledge deemed critical for the world was withheld by the very institution meant to be its steward. The story of the third secret is a perfect case study. It demonstrates a clear pattern. Information is received, assessed for its potential impact on institutional stability, and then managed, delayed, interpreted, and released only when the narrative can be controlled. It suggests a deep-seated belief within the institution that the faithful and the world at large cannot be trusted with the raw, unmediated truth. But the Fatima prophecy is not the only text in the archive that points towards a dramatic conclusion for the Church. Another, even older and more cryptic prophecy has been waiting in the shadows, a prophecy that claims to list every pope, right up to the very last one. But the anxieties revealed by the Fatima affair are not new. They are simply a modern expression of a much older question that has haunted the papacy for centuries. Does this institution have an expiration date? While the secret of Fatima points to a crisis within the Church, there is another, far more enigmatic text that speaks of the crisis of the Church. The end of the entire line. It is known as the Prophecy of the Popes, attributed to a 12th century Irish bishop named St. Malachy. According to legend, Malachy received a vision in Rome in the year 1139, a vision that laid out the entire future of the papacy in the form of 112 short cryptic Latin phrases. Each phrase, a motto for a future pope, starting with Celestine II and ending supposedly with the very last one. The text itself is a masterpiece of minimalist dread. From a castle on the Tiber, the bear's cub, the flowers of flowers. For centuries, interpreters have tried to map these strange descriptions onto the lives, coats of arms, or birthplaces of popes, often with startling success. But this is where any serious investigation runs into a wall. A very specific, very suspicious wall. The prophecies are remarkably clear and accurate for every pope up until 1590. And then, after that date, they become vague, symbolic, and open to almost any interpretation. According to most historical scholarship, there is a simple reason for this. The prophecy of the popes is almost certainly a 16th century forgery. It was likely created during the heated papal conclave of 1590, possibly as a piece of propaganda to support the candidacy of a particular cardinal. It's a classic case of what's known as vaticinium ex eventu, a prophecy written after the events it pretends to predict. The text doesn't appear in any known record before its first publication in 1595. To be clear, we are not dealing with a genuine ancient prophecy. But that almost makes it more interesting. Because the forgery's true power, the reason it has survived for over 400 years and still sends a chill down the spine, is not in its description of the 111 popes. It's in its description of the final one. After the 111th motto, the text breaks its pattern. It gives the final pope a name, __, quote _34, __, or Peter the Roman. And it concludes with a final terrifying paragraph in plain Latin, __, quote _35, __. Here, the purpose of the text becomes clear. It's not just a list, it is a countdown, a narrative clock, ticking toward a final, cataclysmic event. And whether it was written in the 12th century or the 16th, its enduring fascination tells us something important. It shows that the idea of the Vatican's collapse is not a modern conspiracy theory. It is a possibility that has been embedded within Western culture for centuries, a story of an ending, waiting patiently in the archives for its time to come. This intuition, that a great systemic change is on the horizon, is not confined to the walls of the Church. The prophecies of Fatima and Malachy, as potent as they are not isolated anomalies. They are simply the most well-known examples from within one tradition, reflecting a much older and wider pattern. It's as if history itself has a shadow, a persistent counter-narrative that runs parallel to the official story, always whispering the same thing. This order is not permanent. Think of the 16th century French apothecary and seer, Michel de Nostradame or Nostradamus. For our purposes, it doesn't matter whether you believe his cryptic poetic quatrains were genuine predictions of the future. What matters is the function they served. In an age when the Inquisition was still a potent force, his work represented a different kind of history, a future that was not under the exclusive control of the Church and Crown. His prophecies were a parallel track, a vision of causality and destiny that operated outside the authorized system. They suggested that history was driven by hidden forces that a sufficiently perceptive mind could glimpse without needing an institution to interpret them. Or consider the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, another mid-20th century bombshell just like the texts at Nag Hammadi. Here again, buried in the desert for 2 millennia, was a library from a community that defined itself in opposition to the religious establishment of its day. While the scholarly debates are complex, the scrolls paint a picture of a teacher of righteousness, locked in a struggle against a corrupt priesthood in Jerusalem. It's an ancient echo of the same theme, a small group preserving what they believe to be a pure, uncompromised truth against a powerful, compromised institution. What this pattern reveals is something fundamental. The prophecies of Nostradamus, the texts of the Qumran community, the visions of Fatima, they are all symptoms of the same deep human impulse. They are a cultural immune response to the claim of a total monopoly on truth. The persistence of these stories, across centuries and cultures, suggests that no matter how powerful an institution becomes, no matter how complete its control over the narrative may seem, it can never entirely extinguish the intuition that there are other possibilities. That the official version of reality is not the only one. For centuries, these counter-narratives were just that: stories, visions, whispers on the margins. They were ideas, powerful but intangible, passed down in secret or in code. They could inspire, they could frighten, but they lacked the power to physically dismantle the system they questioned. But the force that may finally bring this system to its knees is not a mystical prophecy from the past. It's a technology of the present. But what if the prophecies were not meant to be read as a literal timetable of events? What if they were expressions of a deep intuitive understanding of a system reaching its limits? Every structure, no matter how solid, has a point of failure. The prophets, the mystics, the dissenters, perhaps they sensed the coming of a force that this ancient architecture of control was simply not designed to withstand. For centuries, the Vatican fought a slow, manageable war of information. When the printing press arrived in the 15th century, it was a revolution. For the first time, an idea could replicate itself faster than a scribe could write. The institution's response was equally revolutionary. It created the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, a centralized firewall against dangerous thought. The battle was fought over centuries, with books being banned, confiscated, and burned. It was a difficult, expensive war, but a winnable one. The model of control, though challenged, still held. And then, in the late 20th century, a new technology emerged. It wasn't just a faster printing press. It was a fundamental change in the physics of information itself, the Internet. The Vatican's entire system was built on a principle of centralized, top-down control. Information flowed from a single source, Rome, outward to the world, carefully filtered and curated. The Internet is the precise structural opposite. It is decentralized, with no center to attack. It is instantaneous, erasing the luxury of time the archive once enjoyed, and it is interactive, a many-to-many conversation that cannot be silenced by a single decree. The old model was a fortress with high walls and a single gate. The new model is a flood. Information no longer knocks at the gate. It seeps through every crack, rises from the ground up and falls from the sky. We saw the power of this new reality with phenomena like WikiLeaks, where a small, stateless organization could challenge the information monopoly of a global superpower. The same principle applies here. A single researcher in a remote library can now share a discovery with the world in seconds. A scanned page from a forbidden text can go viral, reaching more people in an afternoon than the Inquisition could have silenced in a century. To be fair, this flood is not a pure stream of truth. It is a chaotic, raging torrent, filled with just as much misinformation, noise, and deliberate deception as it is with genuine insight. This new environment doesn't solve the problem of truth, it simply changes the nature of the problem. The challenge is no longer how to get information out of the fortress. The challenge is how to navigate the endless, unfiltered wilderness that has replaced it. But one thing is certain, the fortress itself is now just a landmark in a landscape it no longer controls. The era of the institutional gatekeeper, the sole arbiter of reality, has come to a definitive end. So let us take a moment, here at the end of our path, and retrace our steps. Where has this investigation truly led us? It began in the quiet, climate-controlled heart of a sovereign state, with a number that defies easy comprehension: 53 miles of shelves. It began with the Vatican Apostolic Archive, a physical place that serves as a powerful metaphor for a much larger idea. The idea that history is not something that simply happens, but something that is collected, curated, and controlled. We saw how the simple, bureaucratic rules of access and the 75-year waiting period create a system of managed memory. But we quickly realized that the most important archive is not made of paper and ink. It is conceptual. We journeyed back to the chaotic, vibrant world of early Christianity and found not one faith, but many. And we witnessed the slow, deliberate process by which this diversity was tamed. A theological marketplace was replaced by a single, authorized canon. The voices of the Gnostics, with their radical message of an inner divinity that required no intermediary, were not just debated, they were excluded. This was the foundational act of control, the construction of a pipeline to God, with the institution as its sole operator. From there, the walls of this conceptual archive expanded. We saw how the same logic of selection was applied not just to theology, but to the entire story of humanity. The comforting linear narrative of progress, which places our civilization at the pinnacle of history, stands in opposition to the unsettling evidence of cycles, of forgotten high technologies and civilizations that rise and fall. Control the past, and you control the present's sense of its own importance. The archive's walls even reach for the stars. We found an institution of ancient faith deeply invested in the modern science of the cosmos, wrestling with the implications of extraterrestrial life, a potential disruption not just to doctrine, but to the entire story of human centrality in the universe. And finally, we saw that this grand structure of reality was not maintained by passive curation alone. When ideas proved too dangerous to merely exclude, the system developed an immune response. The Holy Office of the Inquisition was not just an instrument of punishment, it was a mechanism of intellectual warfare. We saw it in the ashes of Giordano Bruno, a man executed not for a scientific error, but for a cosmic vision that made the institution's claims feel small. And we saw it in the bureaucratic precision of the Index of Forbidden Books, a centuries-long declaration that some knowledge is too dangerous for humanity to possess. From a single building in Rome, a system of reality was built. A system that defines not only what is true, but what is possible to even think. And so, we arrive at the central, beating heart of this entire investigation, the thread that connects the locked archives, the silenced Gnostics, the distant stars, and the fires of the Inquisition. It is the simple, devastatingly powerful idea of Gnosticism, direct knowledge, the conviction that a human being can know the divine knowledge, the conviction that a human being does not require an intermediary, a priest, or an institution to connect with the fundamental truths of existence. This was the original threat. Not a different set of dogmas, but a different relationship with reality. It was the declaration that the divine was not locked away in a distant heaven, accessible only through authorized channels. It was here, within, an inner kingdom waiting to be discovered. For an institution built on being the sole gatekeeper to that kingdom, this was not just a heresy, it was an existential threat. For nearly 2 millennia, the architecture of information itself supported the gatekeepers. Knowledge was physical. It was ink on parchment, bound in leather. To control knowledge, you simply had to control the books. You could collect them, lock them away, or burn them. The system of control was as physical as the archive walls themselves, but the force that is now shaking this ancient foundation is not a prophecy or a mystical event. It is a technology. The internet, for all its chaos, its noise, and its dangers, is the accidental technical fulfillment of the Gnostic ideal. It is a system designed by its very nature to resist central control. A piece of information, once released into this network, is like a drop of ink in water. You can no longer retrieve it. You cannot burn a billion copies that exist on a billion screens. This is not a mystical awakening. It is a structural one. The architecture of knowledge itself has been fundamentally rewritten. For the first time in history, any individual with a connection can, in theory, access the same raw materials that were once the exclusive domain of scholars with privileged access. They can read the Gnostic Gospels from Nag Hammadi. They can pull up the declassified documents. They can access academic debates, scientific papers, and historical archives from their own home. Of course, the internet does not deliver truth. More often, it delivers a tidal wave of misinformation, of curated narratives and digital mirages. But that isn't the point. The point is that it breaks the monopoly. It dissolves the very concept of a single authorized source. It doesn't give us the answers, but it gives us unprecedented access to the questions. The burden of verification, for better or worse, is shifting away from the institution and back onto the individual. The gatekeepers have not vanished. They are still here, more powerful in some ways than ever. But the walls around the garden of knowledge have crumbled, and in this new chaotic landscape, millions of people are beginning to do something that was once unthinkable. They are beginning to conduct their own investigations. They are learning to be their own archivists, their own historians, and their own theologians. They are reclaiming the right to direct knowledge. This, then, is the final turning point of our investigation. We have spent this entire journey searching for a secret, a hidden object, a single, tangible piece of evidence that would change everything. The lost gospel of a silenced apostle, the logbook of an extraterrestrial visitor, the forgotten map of a sunken city. We have searched for a key that would unlock a final door, behind which the ultimate, definitive truth resides. But what if this entire search, as compelling as it is based on a fundamental misunderstanding? What if we have been looking for the wrong thing? We have been searching for a noun, a book, an artifact, a fact. But what if the true secret was never a noun, but a verb, an action, a process? The ultimate power of the system we have described was never just about possessing a hidden truth. Its real genius was in convincing the world that truth was a thing that needed to be possessed at all, and that only one institution had the authority to possess it. The real forbidden knowledge was not a specific text locked in a vault. It was the method of independent inquiry itself. The real heresy was not believing the wrong thing, but believing that you had the right to find out for yourself. By controlling the archive, the institution controlled the past. By controlling the canon, it controlled the sacred. By controlling the index, it controlled the dangerous. But in doing all this, it achieved something far more profound. It controlled the questions people felt they were allowed to ask. The system made the very act of direct, unmediated seeking seem illegitimate, arrogant, and perilous. And this is the true revolution of our time. It is not that one secret has been revealed, but that the monopoly on the act of revelation itself has been broken. The internet and the global network of independent researchers have not provided a new singular answer to replace the old one. They have provided something infinitely more powerful, a distributed planetary scale capacity to ask better questions, to cross-reference evidence, and to build understanding outside of any central authority. By engaging with this journey, by asking these questions alongside me, you're no longer just a listener to a story. You have become an active participant in this process. You are a node in this new decentralized network of discovery. The power you gain from this is not the certainty of a new belief. It is the freedom of a new method. The freedom to weigh evidence, to tolerate ambiguity, to hold theories lightly, and to follow the data wherever it leads. The ultimate freedom, then, is not to finally break into the Vatican's vault. It is to realize the vault you truly needed to escape was the one built in your own mind, the one that told you to wait for permission to understand the world. The real treasure was never a hidden book, but the right to read. It was never a forbidden history, but the right to investigate. It was never a cosmic secret, but the courage to look up at the stars and ask your own questions. This, then, is the final turning point of our investigation. We have spent this entire journey searching for a secret, a hidden object, a single tangible piece of evidence that would change everything. the lost gospel of a silenced apostle, the logbook of an extraterrestrial visitor, the forgotten map of a sunken city. We have searched for a key that would unlock a final door behind which the ultimate definitive truth resides. But what if this entire search, as compelling as it is based on a false premise? The premise that truth is a thing that can be possessed, an artifact that can be stored, catalogued, and locked away in a vault. We have looked for the contents of the archive, but perhaps the real secret was never inside the books. Perhaps the secret is the architecture itself, the very existence of the shelves, the locks, the walls. Because an institution that builds 53 miles of walls around its memory is telling us something profound, not just about itself, but about the nature of the knowledge it contains. It suggests that this knowledge is dangerous, that it is fragile, that it must be protected not only from the elements, but from people. And in doing so, it elevates the archivist to the role of gatekeeper, and the institution to the sole arbiter of reality. The search for a hidden truth becomes a quest for permission, and here we find ourselves looking into a mirror. For centuries, the Vatican did not exist in a vacuum. Its power was not sustained by force alone, but by a silent contract with humanity, a deep-seated human yearning for certainty, a fear of the chaotic open field of 1,000 different truths. The Gnostic garden was wild and beautiful, but it offered no single map, no final authority. And so, perhaps we, as a species, collectively chose the walled garden instead. We traded the burden of infinite possibility for the comfort of a single story. The walls of the archive, the canons of scripture, the indexes of forbidden books, they were not built only by cardinals and popes. They were built brick by every soul that chose to outsource its own search for meaning. Every time we accepted an answer without questioning it, every time we deferred to authority rather than undertaking the difficult work of direct experience, we added another stone to the wall. So the ultimate mystery of the Vatican is not what lies hidden in its deepest, most secret vault. It is not an object that can be stolen or a text that can be leaked. It is a question that this ancient, powerful, and enduring institution forces us to ask ourselves. Why do we build walls around knowledge? What are we so afraid of finding, both in the dusty records of the past and in the uncharted territories of our own consciousness? The enduring mystery of the Vatican, perhaps, is not what its walls conceal from the world, but what they reveal about it, and about our own long, complicated, and unfinished journey toward the light.